First of all, define what the goal of the company is and we'll set the goal big. If you're going to aim really, really high, do something that if you're successful, because the chances of failing are very high, make sure that it was worth it. Would it be possible to grow algae at a sort of economically favorable to crude oil? What are the fundamentals? Could you possibly grow algae that cheap? It must be economic. If there's not an economic reason to do it, it will not happen.
Hello crew, let's talk about the climb and not just the peak. Today's guest is someone who doesn't just build companies, he builds systems that change how the world works. Nick Hazell founded V2 Food, which became Australia's market leader in plant-based protein. Not just Australia, actually global leader, raising 180 million, scaling nationally and internationally, and partnering with major retailers and food chains. Post-exit from the company, Nick decided to be a second-time climate tech founder of Algenie, a breakthrough biotech company. Algenie, my apologies.
That's okay.
A breakthrough biotech company scaling algae, biomanufacturing for food, fuel and materials. He also previously led R&D at Mars and PepsiCo, among many other very impressive titles and things. Few founders understand both the science and the scrappy realities of building climate technology at scale, like Nick does. Nick, welcome to Fail Tales.
It's good to be here.
What a career journey. Talk me through it. How have you gone here and gone through all the various different avenues you've been to?
Yeah, so a journey implies that you've got a start and you've got a destination, and I've never had really any of that. It just sort of evolved.
Organically over time?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in making stuff and always been curious. Always, I was the nerd who spent their childhood reading encyclopedias and just wanting to know how things worked. And it led to a studying engineering at Cambridge. And engineering, really, because my brother did it, is that simple. And I could do it. I could do the maths and do all the physics and stuff. And then a career in aerospace, which was my first career, which was making countermeasures to jam missiles, I think was the first thing, and do all sorts of other secret electronic stuff, which was, I think I signed up for 40 years of official secret. So it might be that I can say more about that now. But that led into manufacturing jobs, and then a manufacturing job in the food industry at Mars. And ultimately, I think to get me out of the factory, changing lots of stuff, which you're not supposed to do when you're a factory manager and an engineer, I got into R&D and ended up as R&D director for Mars in UK, first of all, and then Holland, and then Australia. Mm-hmm. And I thought I was going to be in corporate all of my life. Actually, I thought I was going to be at Mars for all of my career. But what actually happened was that after 5 years of R&D director at Mars, doing some quite cool innovation, I needed to be moved to another place. You have a tenure as an R&D director because otherwise you get stale. At least that was the thinking at the time. And the other places on offer were places I really couldn't take my family at the time.
Like where?
Russia was one of them. Eastern Europe. Poland, which wouldn't have been too bad in hindsight. And the other was Tennessee in the US, which I really couldn't imagine bringing our kids, changing education systems, etc. So I left and joined Pepsi and had a great time engineering a lot of snacks products, and then got made redundant from PepsiCo, which was really interesting. Just after I'd won the Chairman's Award for Innovation for PepsiCo, we engineered there was a big purpose mission for PepsiCo at the time to halve the amount of salt, get rid of saturated fat in the snacks, reduce sugar levels. And I was kind of fully signed up to those big goals. That was my job, I felt, as the R&D director, to figure out a way of doing it. And they were 20-year goals, but we did them in Australia while I was R&D director, and I received an award for that. And then pretty much the next day, or certainly a few weeks later, I was made redundant.
What a strange decision.
It was to do with centralization of big, you see it a lot in corporate, is that R&D, no one really knows where to put research and development. And it's seen as a cost. And if you can minimize that by centralizing it, it all looks on paper that that's a really good thing. I happen to believe that Australia is a great place for doing R&D.
I agree.
And because it's kind of far enough away that people don't stop you doing your stuff. But it's also a developed market. So what you do in Australia is actually applicable to a lot of other geographies. So we did heaps of stuff in Australia. it's just the way of the world with large corporations. They decentralize and then they centralize, and they decentralize and centralize. That's a story that you see in all of the large companies. But that was great. I was glad to be made redundant because I then started teaching innovation because I'd been doing it and I wanted to learn the theoretical, if there was a theoretical underpinning of what it was that I was doing. Discovered there wasn't really very much, so we had to sort of figure it out ourselves to teach it.
Were you teaching university students?
There was a degree that I was in the sort of the team that built it. It was called the Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation at UTS.
Wow. Okay.
And it's basically it's a way of the central thesis is that innovation happens at the boundaries of disciplines, the boundaries of knowledge, and where one discipline collides with another, that's probably where the best ideas are going to be found. And you see that with all ecosystems. It's on the boundaries that the interesting stuff happens. So this was a transdisciplinary degree where engineers would be working alongside marketeers and physicists and lawyers. And I think there were 22 or more disciplines that all had to work together on big problems and kind of learn each other's language and learn the different perspectives, so they all look at a problem from a different perspective. And the truth is actually the combination of those perspectives. But you've got to actually learn how to speak other people's languages in order to accept that, yeah, there could be a good idea from a lawyer. It is possible. And bring them all to bear on a difficult problem. And that got me in a really good place to actually start my entrepreneurial journey, because I'd been an intrapreneur up until then in large companies. And I did a project with the CSRO, which was, they asked me to take a look at this plant-based meat space. Was it an interesting area for some technology that CSRO were developing? Would there be an opportunity there? And I, as a consultant, I reported back, yes, I thought there was a big opportunity. And then, of course, they asked me to start a company. So that was, I was an entrepreneur, but I was kind of like assisted into it. It's not something that I ever really considered.
Wow, it just happened.
Yeah, and I had nothing better to do at the time. And it was an area which I'd done the research to understand why plant-based meat was so important. And I'd thought through from first principles, how are we going to feed the planet in a way that's consistent with the planetary boundaries? And kind of job one is to slow down the increase in meat consumption and ideally reduce meat consumption, because
Agreed.
Most of the land we've got on the planet we're using to grow animal feed, and we don't have much land left, and we're still destroying the Amazon at a rate of knots which is unconscionable, and it's really just to feed the animals that we like to kill and eat. So it felt to me like something had to be done, and that I had the toolkit to solve it. So that was the big mission of V2 Food. How do you slow down and ultimately reduce the amount of animal meat that was being consumed?
Wow. I find it very interesting that you were working in R&D and innovation, but you never saw yourself as a founder per se. You didn't see yourself starting a company or something of your own?
No. Yeah, personally, no, I never thought of starting a company. I thought, look, you're in big companies, you've got these big brands there. It's like when you do something for a large company like Mars and Pepsi, you've immediately got access to millions of consumers. You've got all of those resources.
You can test it very quickly.
I thought that would be the way forward. The reality is actually that it's very difficult to get innovation off the ground in large companies. You should look at a company as almost like it's already a fully developed organism that has an immune system, which is basically there to make sure it can carry on replicating in the future. And I think that comparison with your sort of a biological system is quite interesting. And the job of a company is to replicate the great things that they did in the past into the future. And so, innovation is almost the opposite. It's actually trying to break things and do things differently. And you can imagine why, in a lot of company, one of the classic things you do in a large company is if you're trying to do something really different, you go into guerrilla mode, you go into skunk works. And the reason is because you're making yourself invisible from all of those people that will try and shut you down. From the accountants who will say, well, hang on, what's the IRR on that bit of research you're doing? And you say, well, I don't know. We need to do the research first to find out if it pans out. To the quality and safety people is like, well, how do you prove that it's safe? you've never done it before. And of course, the answer is, well, we don't know, but we're going to go along the way and we'll prove it. Well, that's not good enough, obviously, because there's a lot of other products that are definitely safe because they're the things that you did before. So you could imagine in a large company, everyone's trying to shut you down, but you have scale. Whereas in a startup, no one's going to shut you down because no one knows what you're doing and you're nothing anyway to anybody. So you've got complete freedom, but you also have no resources. So it's, and I always thought that, for example, with PepsiCo, like figuring out how to halve the amount of sodium in a company like PepsiCo means that I've impacted, 1 billion people positively. That's going to have far more impact than if you do a little startup that really doesn't affect thousands of people, let alone billions of people. But as we say, the chance came to do a startup, and so and I figured that the mission was something which could have impact. So go for it.
Yeah. What were the early days like, and especially translating research into a real product, which I find always very fascinating?
Yeah, it was. Well, first of all, define what the goal of the company is, and for me, it's always helpful to set the goal big. If you're gonna spend years of your life and doing ridiculous hours, and you might as well do something that at the end of it, imagine you're successful, and you go back when you're successful and say, well, was it worth it? If the answer is no, so you did all that work and you were successful, and then you look at it and then think, was it worth it? And the answer is no. Well, you shouldn't have begun. So aim really, really high. Do something that if you're successful, because the chances of failing are very high, it doesn't matter how good you are, startup, the chances of failing are very high. Make sure that it was worth it. And so the mission for V2 was absolutely make an impact at global scale on the amount of meat that was being consumed. And for me, it was very clear, what are the obstacles for people to eat meat? Well, the reality is that if people had more money on average on the planet, they would eat more meat. So I was looking at these other products that were being launched around the world at the time, like Impossible and Beyond, and they were at the time about 3 times more expensive than meat. A burger was 3 times, or mince was 3 times.
So the average person's not going to lean for that option.
Irrelevant to the real problem at hand, which is that people who are relatively poor don't eat a lot of meat, but are the vast majority of the world.
That's true.
Are going to eat more meat when they get rich. And that's exactly what happens. Every single country you look at, there is a direct relationship between GDP per capita and meat consumption. And so you're thinking, if you set your mission as doing something useful on a planetary scale, because that's my motivation, it's what can you do on that's going to affect climate change. You better have something that's going to solve the real problem. And so cost had to be part of it. And so right from the first principles, we were thinking, what technology can we bring to bear? How do we make our meat? What's the supply chain look like for us to be much cheaper than meat? And no one else was doing that. Everyone else was doing the clever chemistry and figuring out how to make the stuff taste nice. I would argue not very nice, most of the products out there. But they didn't address the fundamental problem, which was a cost problem. And V2 Food, right from the get-go, was thinking, how can we have a supply chain that's cheaper? How do we have something that's cheaper? And that was the big difference between V2 Food and all of the other competitors. And that's one of the reasons why it's still up and running and doing very well, and also able to address plant-based meat in developing markets directly, which is a part of V2 which not many people will know about. But that's actually one of the things I'm almost most proud of. I'm proud of the fact that it's in Burger Kings around the world, and it's in the supermarkets in Australia. But the fact that it's in Nigeria, for example, and it solves the meat problem in Nigeria, which is cost and convenience, because no one wants to have to get up at 5 a.m. and walk 10 kilometers to the wet meat market to get a fresh animal that's been killed. There's no chilled distribution in most of these markets. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty much a wet market scenario. Well, what's your intervention so that you solve the cost problem and the convenience problem? And that's basically one of the technologies that V2 had, was you take dry ingredients and then you effectively add water, and that becomes your plant-based meat. And you can either do it at a meat factory in Australia, and then that goes into the chilled distribution system, actually the same distribution system as meat, which is one of the reasons why V2 is so cheap.
Yeah.
Or you give it to an entrepreneur in Nigeria who takes the dry ingredients, adds water, and then they take that meat and turn it into the samosas or the kebabs or the whatever the local products are. And it saves them sort of 2 hours of time in the morning. It's a lot cheaper. And it gives their lives back. They don't have to go to a dirty, dangerous meat market to get their meat every single day of the week. So it's sort of one of those win-wins that that is economically attractive, as well as from an environmental perspective, the best thing you could possibly do.
For sure. And it ties in beautifully with what you said at the start about the mission of why you moved into that space as well, which I think is great.
Yeah, starting off with a big mission it's kind of, I know you talk about failure, but if your mission is so big, all you can have is little steps along the way and changes in direction. It's almost you're too big to even talk about failure, because it's just, what are those steps you're going to go on the way to get to that big goal? And I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because if you set your sights so hard on something that's actually really close and you fail, it really does feel like a failure. Whereas if the journey is a bit further away, the fact that you took a long turn, if you take a wrong turn on the first part of a 100-kilometer journey, you take a wrong side street. No, you haven't failed. You've just, it's a side street, and then you're back on track. New. Yeah, you can still get back on track. It's not a problem. Whereas if your goal is the first half a kilometer and you take a side street and you miss it, you failed. So make sure that your goals are big enough and far enough into the distance. And then it doesn't feel like failure. It might be the same thing. You still make mistakes, and you go down rabbit holes, and that'll happen anyway. It's just, can you recover from that, and can you still progress towards your goal?
How quickly you pivot. What were the side streets that you went down along your journey of V2 Foods, and mistakes and lessons learned?
Oh, there's lots. I mean, there's lots of things I thought that we could do quicker. There were things that I had that I was absolutely convinced were necessary to achieve the goal. One of them was, for example, plant-based meats use protein from plants. So in V2, it's soy protein is the dominant ingredient, and soy protein is kind of an industrial ingredient. It's been there for 50 years. The extraction of protein from soy, and it's quite a big chemical operation to take the protein from soy. Very expensive, and it was something that I really thought that we could do in a better way. You could combine high protein soy strains and process it in a much more gentle way to get to a better protein, much cheaper than what you would buy from these ingredient suppliers. And I was convinced that would even halve the cost. Even we were still very low cost, but then halve it again, and so we would be so much cheaper than meat. I kind of underestimated how difficult it was. And the good news is we had a supply solution without developing our own way of doing it, so we could carry on. But I know I did waste quite a lot of time. And to be honest, I'm no longer with V2. I don't believe that project is still running. I still believe that it is something that should be done. And it's on my list I've always got a list of 100 things that I would like to do if I live long enough. And that would be to solve that particular problem. That was not an error, but it was something which was unrealizable in the timeframes. I underestimated how difficult it was. I had a few other quite a few missteps in there. I launched into China during COVID without meeting the general manager who I'd recruited, even though he came on very high recommendation from some investors, and turned out to be somebody who wasn't what he said he was and didn't do what he said he did. And I had no means of checking. I can remember that was a very difficult period where we weren't getting the information, and we wasted time and money on that. Other errors? No. I mean, the broad concept I still believe in. I think we had a lot of fights, some of which we won and some of which we lost.
What kind of fights?
getting listing in supermarkets was pretty tough.
Yes, I was going to ask that. What's that? Yeah, the experience been like with retailers and their perception of plant-based meats and whether they thought there was a market and things like that?
Yeah, it's funny because it goes through this, like with a lot of innovations, you have this sort of classic curve of, wild optimism, actually unrealistic optimism. The thing just goes off like a big bubble, and then it sort of comes crashing down. And some of the early valuations of the market leaders at the time of Impossible and Beyond were astronomical, which was great for me because I was raising money as the third player, if you like. So it was easy for me to raise money. But the reality was that people were interested in the category. They'd heard that there's something about meat which isn't quite right, and there were some stories about sustainability. So people were willing to try it, but the products actually didn't really deliver in the beginning. But what had happened with the supermarkets is they kind of said, right, we're going to explode the category, and they invited everybody in. I think at one point in Australia, just in Australia, which is a tiny market, there were 25 players on the shelves. So everyone was on the shelves, and the consumer was looking at the shelf going, and there is, it's like there is such a thing called category management in supermarkets, which is make the shelf easy for consumers to shop. When you go shopping, you're often not in the right headspace anyway. And the last thing you need is confusion. So you want to make the shelf easy to shop, which normally means there's one or two big brands and a couple of small ones, but that's it, And here there was 25 products, and consumer completely lost. And not only that, they would just say, "Oh, okay, I'll buy one," and many of the products were really quite horrible. And if you have one bad experience tasting a food, and you can't even remember what the brand was, you'll just say, "Oh, plant-based meat doesn't taste good. I'll avoid that." And we had great product that was, consumers loved. And when they found us and they remembered the brand, they would go back and buy us. So we had very high repeat. But consumers were really confused and were just rejecting the category completely. So it's one of those things that will come good again. It always has a peak, and then it goes down, and then it starts to grow again, because the fundamentals, people still want to reduce their meat intake. There's still a problem, particularly millennials and younger people. They really don't want to eat as much meat.
Yeah.
And they're looking for alternatives, and hopefully some brands will survive and will grow and actually become a significant part of the meat consumption, because that's, let's face it, being 1 or 2% of total meat consumption is not going to change anything. You've got to be 10, 20, 30% of the meat that people eat should be plant-based.
100% agreed. I'm really fascinated to see what that looks like in the future, because like you said, a lot of young people are looking to be more sustainable and are looking to try new alternatives. I'm keen to hear more about your journey and the process of transitioning from being a startup to now a global company, and then the exit from V2 Food. What was that like, growing nationally and then expanding internationally? And as a founder who had a mission in mind, how did that transition as well, and how did you manage that? Because I imagine going back to corporate and I guess PepsiCo and those big companies, things become harder and innovation becomes more challenging. How did that tension work? And yeah,
I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it was very clear to me that the solution for plant-based meat, given our mission, it was always going to be global. I mean, there wasn't even a question for me. Of course, it's going to be global. So even early into the piece, and I started doing some early research in Ghana, for example, I knew that we had to find a solution for developing markets. I could not do that. It wasn't a question of, let's launch in Australia and then 10 years later we'll think about expanding. No, we're talking about climate change here. This is not something that you do over the next 30 years.
No, we don't have time.
We have not got time. We have to move fast. So there was a real sense of urgency. And, Australia and working in Australia was about getting a model so we knew what we were doing and that we had a product so that we could expand. It was never a question of, okay, we will make sure that we're a profitable business and get really solid and safe, and then we'll think about expanding. No, do everything all at once, which is quite probably a non-commercial approach, because normally it's like just,
very much so.
But as long as every part of that, you could see that there was a route to profitability and that it made economic sense. And I could see, for example, that we talked about the developing markets, that actually in theory, that should be more profitable for us in delivering a solution which was much, much cheaper. But in total, the whole system cost was much more efficient. I love the idea that perhaps in Africa, in the same way that you don't go and build a huge phone network, you go straight to a mobile solution and then mobile banking. So you don't build a banking system, you don't build a telephone system, you just go straight to mobile and then an app, and then suddenly you got, a very advanced banking system, which has just cut out all of the crap that's happened in the developed markets, because you don't need that infrastructure anymore. Similarly for meat, you could go straight to a solution which solves the meat problem. So instead, when they grow from 5 or 10 kilos per person per year, which is what the meat consumption is in Nigeria, towards the 120, which is the meat consumption in Australia, that it isn't done via animals, it's done to something better.
It's 120 in Australia per person.
Yeah, we're the second biggest meat eaters. And it's an interesting story because when we did the maths, and obviously I looked at the whole world of meat eating, and you could see that this direct correlation with wealth and meat eating. And the story you got to know is China. So China in the Hunger Years, where, literally there was starvation, meat consumption was less than 5 kilos per person per year. Now I was going to say 40 because that was the number I quoted when I was at V2. It's now at 50 kilos per person per year. And guess what? The champions of the world, meat consumption, Hong Kong, 130. And that's what China's going to become. And there is a sort of an inherent thirst for more meat, and it's derived from memories of the Hunger Years. If you're wealthy, you eat meat. It's kind of, if you want to show people you're wealthy, put lots of meat on the table, and that's very much in the culture. But if you multiplied 1 billion people by that increase in meat consumption, you can kind of say goodbye to the Amazon. It's that sort of scale. And then on top of that, you've got some billions in Africa, billions in India, all with relatively low meat consumption, and they'll all progress towards the sort of meat consumption that we have. In fact, Australia is now going down because of what you said. There's a lot of millennials and young people who are saying, well, hang on a minute, we shouldn't be eating so much meat. And that's the same for very rich Western economies. California's going down, but from a very, very high base. In a way, they're not the problem. It's like they're going down. It's the people coming up. So that's kind of how you set out your stall. You set out what's the problem you're trying to solve with an eye on climate change, and you try and solve the right problem.
What is the ideal meat consumption per person on average?
I don't think there is an ideal.
Okay.
There isn't an ideal. We're omnivores, and meat does have a role in our diet. I think there's some nutrition that you struggle to get without some meat. So iron seems to be one, B12. In V2, we supplemented the product to make sure that there was no bad outcomes nutritionally. But things like bioavailability of iron can be a problem for certain people. It varies. And sometimes, red meat is actually an important nutrition for some people, but never as much as, it's like we kind of evolved as sort of hunter-gatherers where our diet was plant-based. And then every now and again, you got lucky. You managed to kill something, or you found a carcass somewhere that had been killed by some other animal, and that would be your meat. But then you wouldn't have any meat for many days. So that's kind of how we should think about meat. Maybe it's nice every now and again, but it's not something that should be on your plate 3 times a day. That was never our existence. And that's where you start getting poor health outcomes, as well as obviously from an environmental perspective. You need so much more land to grow a kilo of beef versus a kilo of soy. It's about 25 to 30 times more land, because the cow's got to live as well. They're not very efficient at converting soy into meat. So it's really doesn't, it's okay if there's only a few million humans on the planet, but not when you've got 10 billion humans devouring the amount of meat that we are capable of devouring. Just doesn't work.
No. I'm curious to find out why the expansion into China didn't work out, apart from hiring the wrong GM.
COVID, not being there, wrong GM, and then and then we got out. It was very simple, untenable situation, hard decision, get out. No reason why you can't go back in, but of course it takes a little while once you've licked your wounds and stuff. So no doubt this thing will happen. You've got to appeal to local tastes as well. And I think certainly the idea of just, there were some companies that were just trying to sell burgers to the Chinese. It's like, well, hang on a minute. That's not what's eaten.
No.
So you've got to make sure that particularly with food, you've got to adapt to local tastes. I've spent 30 years innovating in food and it's really hard. I mean, we like to eat what our grandmums cooked us. Food is a comfort thing. It's a human thing to be very conservative with food. It's probably a good thing because it probably stopped us from poisoning ourselves by eating strange foods from an evolutionary perspective. But it does mean that the trends take a while to change in food. So very difficult to really do breakthrough innovation in food because we are inherently conservative. And then layer on top of that, trying to take something that was developed in one country and just saying, okay, this is good. Nah, you've got to adapt to local conditions. So I think we could have probably done a better job there, but no doubt it will come. And
you made the decision to exit the company. How did that come about?
Well, yeah, I say I made the decision. It was a joint decision with all of these things. But what was very clear was that we were on divergent paths, me and the board. What happened basically is we'd raised a lot of money with V2. It was a bit of a bubble. I think we raised about 180 million over a number of investment rounds, which in the scheme of things isn't a lot. There's a lot of other companies that have raised an awful lot more. But it was clear that 3 or 4 years ago, the environment changed completely. The investment environment changed, and it was all about what can you do with the money you've got? How do you get to profitability quicker? So it wasn't about expanding at all cost. It was very much around cut your cloth, make sure you're not going to run out of money, and it was getting to the point where the idea of innovating to create and solve bigger and bigger problems wasn't really what was required. What was required was to hold on, cut things down, make things profitable, and just sort of keep it very tight. And my background as an R&D director, I live for innovation. I live for solving impossible problems. I'd already recruited an operating officer to run the business so that I could do that. And it was very clear that the job to be done was not my job. It was actually just to operate the business. And so we agreed that I would leave the business, which was good because I already had an idea about another bigger problem that I wanted to solve, which was what we're doing at Algenie, based on technology that we developed at V2 Food, or based on not technology, but based on some insights that I got about algae and about how you grow algae and how you might reduce the cost of growing algae. And so it didn't take me very long after I'd finished my gardening leave to start a new company to solve another big sustainability problem.
For someone who knows nothing about algae, can you explain what the opportunities are with it and what you saw?
I think you should go back to what is algae, which is, and actually you have to go back to the origins of the Earth. I mean, the reason why we have a livable planet is because of algae. So before life on Earth, we were a planet that was hot, and it was full of CO2. Like the atmosphere was CO2, so it was a very hot planet. And what happened was that some organism created itself that could take carbon dioxide and essentially carbon dioxide and light and create and to grow with that. And that was a sort of a primitive cyanobacteria. And what it emitted was oxygen. So once this was created and they started replicating, what happened was in the oceans, oxygen was being formed, carbon dioxide was being absorbed, and the atmosphere changed. And then, of course, what happened is you absorb carbon dioxide, so the greenhouse gas layer, which was the most thick doona, if you like, on the planet, got thinner because carbon dioxide was being absorbed. Oxygen was made available, and oxygen is very important for all other forms of life. And over a billion years or so, the event, I'm not a geologist, so I might get my timeframes wrong, but it's the Great Oxygenation. So if it's not billions, then it was hundreds of millions of years. The Earth changed. The temperature got down and the atmosphere changed, and it became a planet where other things could grow. And that was the origin of life on the planet. And that was cyanobacteria or algae, blue-green algae. So algae, what they do is they suck up CO2 and they grow, and they emit oxygen. So, and those deposits of algae ended up as things like crude oil. So it's a terrible simplification, and I'm sure some people would shoot me for saying it, but it's broadly true, is that oil, so the whole industry that we have, the whole industrial complex, is basically built on algae, old algae that was deposited hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. And in the future, all of that petrochemistry, all of those plastics and the polymers and the things you wear and the things you build with, and all of that incredible complexity that we've engineered from oil over the last 100 years, you could engineer from CO2 from the atmosphere if it's economic to do so. So that opens up that delicious sort of thing. Well, would it be possible to grow algae at a sort of economically favorable to crude oil? And that was the question that was consuming me. What are the fundamentals? Could you possibly grow algae that cheap? And I learned while I was at V2 what the costs of growing algae were. So what is it you've got? You've got the photobioreactors themselves. They're really expensive. The tubes and the things that you grow the algae in, or the ponds. There's the algae themselves. Do they grow fast? Can you be really productive? How do you solve that problem? And I guess the third problem is if you're going to use light to grow your algae, where are you going to get the light from? Do you get it direct from the sun, or do you get it from LEDs with renewable power? And I'd learned that there was a big advantage in having control, so using LEDs, so you have the right sort of light for the algae. And then the problem is, how do you get cheap renewable energy? So you put all those together and imagine what the future could look like. And I did the calculations, and I realized that it could be possible to grow algae as cheap as crude oil. And then it gets really exciting, because we do consume gigatons of plastics, and we do consume gigatons of clothes and textiles. And imagine a world where you don't use fossil fuel for any of that, but you make it all out of algae. And then you can start talking about gigatons of carbon dioxide sequestration. That's then exciting, because that's what we actually need to start to mitigate climate change, is to start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere in a way that's economic. And I always have to add that it must be economic, because where's the capital going to come to do these big things unless somebody makes money out of it? And it kind of feels slightly distasteful. It's like, what do you mean you have to make money in order to save the planet? Surely we would save the planet anyway. Well, I mean, where are we now with COP30? I mean, look, we won't. We will not. We've just seen it every year.
Yeah.
If there's not an economic reason to do it, it will not happen. So, we sometimes believe that we're better than we are. We're just stupid, dumb apes. and we will, and we are. So let's recognize that. And then the job of the innovators is to come up with something that is economically interesting and saves the planet. But it's got to be both. You can't just come up with a new technology and say, okay, well, all we have to do is put $1 trillion into that and we'll be okay. No one's going to do it.
Hence the birth of Algenie.
Algenie, yeah. So that was and it was to solve those three problems.
Wow,
so it required a complete rethink of what a photobioreactor looked like. And from first principles, how do you get enough light to the algae so it can grow at its potential? And then how do you make these photobioreactors really, really cheap? Talking about, up to 50 times cheaper than the current photobioreactors. And we came up with some inventions and patents around what we call a helical photobioreactor, which solves the light problem, but I can make really, really cheap on an industrial process, which is very well known, but has never made a helix before. And we figured out how to do it. So it's one of those few sort of true inventions that if we can do what we believe we can do, and we're beginning to prove that we can, it could actually be one of the big solutions for climate change.
That's huge. Are you doing that through a university again? And then...
So I taught innovation at UTS, and I'm actually working with UTS on the biology. Because,
wow, what a full circle
moment.
Well,
UTS, so they're very big on innovation. That's I was very glad to be part of that journey. But they've also been big for quite some decades in algae research. So they've been doing research into algae for 20 or 30 years. And so I'm using their biology department and talking with the scientists and trying to figure out some of the fundamental biology problems that we need to solve in order to get to our mission, which is basically to get algae down towards the cost of crude oil.
It's a huge target.
Well, you know that if you can get in the ballpark, then it'll happen. I mean, if we're, even if we're 10 times the cost of crude oil, it's a nice business. It's still a $1 billion business. It's not a bad business, but it gets much more exciting when you actually see that you could actually make a difference that could have global impact. And that makes it much more exciting.
What's the current cost now, just out of interest?
I don't think you can buy algae less than about $20 a kilo, which is about 20 times the cost of crude oil, maybe $10 a kilo. But it's about one order of magnitude too expensive, and actually probably a bit more than that. So it's quite a big leap. I think people have hypothesized algae solutions for a long time, but it's always been the cost that has sort of come undone. People have made plastics out of algae and polymers and clothing.
That's true. Yeah.
It's all been done, but most of it's sitting on the shelves in the offices of the professors who've done the work, but no commercial reality, no real commercial application.
Has come out, that's true. The government invests about $2 billion. Well, they used to a few years ago. That's gone down on R&D, but often there's a big gap between R&D and the commercialization component. And I worked in an area of government where we had an investment arm. So we co-invested with VCs in Sydney and Melbourne to try and bridge that gap a little bit. And so I'm keen to see more of that within this space because, like you said, there's a lot of great research, but it's mostly sitting on the shelves and in research papers. So I think it's great that you've taken this leap of faith with Algenie.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. The government spends $2 billion. What that number?
That was a couple of years ago. It's definitely gone down now.
Yeah, I mean, there's different spends. I know that there's spends direct sort of grants to universities and stuff, but they are very painfully slow and very sort of science oriented and not really innovation oriented. It's funny. I've always argued. I've been 20 years in Australia and as an R&D director for 11 of those in Australia, and I must admit there is money that is spent purportedly for R&D. So there's an R&D tax system, but very little of it ends up as going into R&D. It ends up as a big tax rebate for large companies to improve their profits after tax, which is not really the idea. So there is definitely work to be done in that space, because the reality is the universities in Australia are impoverished. They really, they are so poor in terms of the amount of resources they have to do research. They've got great academics, but really lacks in the ecosystem this money to do research. And also, there's not many big companies left that actually do research in Australia. PepsiCo moved its research back to the US, and pretty much every food company, I don't know about other industries, but I'm pretty much the same apart from mining.
Why do they do that?
Incentives are not aligned. So there's not a real incentive to do work in Australia compared with the big incentives to do R&D in Singapore or back in Europe or back in the States. So we've really not aligned our incentive structure. The money is there, and R&D tax is an example of the money is set aside for doing it, but the system is designed badly, so the money never actually ends up in the hands of R&D directors who want to do R&D and universities that want to do research. It just is a badly designed system, and I've certainly lobbied uselessly for 20 years to try and get the system changed. I know there's a working group working on it now, which I have given my input to, so hopefully something will change there.
Fingers crossed.
We've got good universities. It's just, and that's what's so strange about Australia. We have great universities, great researchers, but our impact from research is the worst. So we're like top 5 in terms of the research, and we are in the bottom 30 in terms of impact. So there's definitely something to be done in translation that Australia has really missed a trick, and it is correctable.
I agree. And I also think we don't celebrate the impact as well. Like I found out a few years ago that Wi-Fi, the technology was invented in Australia, and I never knew. And I wish that was taught to me in school.
We should dig into that more. Yeah, and it was invented in Australia. And what happened was that it was invented in CSIRO by some scientists to solve another problem. It was to solve a problem between communication with telescopes it was a very different division, nothing to do with, we're going to solve computer problems anyway. And it was patented. And then nothing happened. And then what happened, those patents were infringed many years later by the American companies that were producing computers. And then CSIRO sued those companies for infringing a patent, and they got but it's not really fair to say that Australia invented Wi-Fi. They did invent it, but they didn't apply it. And it's actually the Australian story. We invent stuff. We've got great researchers and great scientists, but we never bring it to impact. And arguably, if these patents hadn't been infringed by these companies, nothing would have happened. If we'd have held on to it in Australia, it would have just been a nice bit of technology doing a little bit of astronomy sort of stuff. It would never have gone into every computer in the world. So it's it's actually an interesting story. It's a story about Australian ingenuity in science, great, but also the only way we can get to impact is for someone to steal it and implement it in a different country.
And sue them for it.
Yeah, but it's fun, isn't it? Because it's, everyone says it's a good story, but I say, well, it's kind
of embarrassing, really.
It's kind of embarrassing in a way. I suppose we did the Hills hoist as well.
That's true.
Which is, no. I
wonder what else we've got.
We could do it. I mean, we really do have great scientists. And certainly if we're successful with Algenie, and you can bring the cost of this growing out, because we've got the renewable energy. So that's the one thing that we do have. We have the opportunity to take cheap renewable energy, convert it into biomass, and then convert that into chemistry using all of these amazing genetic tools, which Australia are right up there. We have that capability at universities. But are we going to create, the thousands of startups that are going to take this technology and turn it into a manufacturing center in the world? And it's not very likely, to be honest, that we're going to be able to do that. We're certainly not investing money in as if we mean that we're going to do it. If you compare our investment in biotech to China, it is 1/500th. Something like that of the amount. It's China investing hundreds of billions of dollars in building biotech pilot plants, and every city seems to be competing with other cities to become the biotech center of China. And I don't think we have one of those in Australia. So
there's a lot of room for growth.
A long way to go. I don't think we're really serious about actually being a sort of a manufacturing sort of superpower. We talk about it, but we don't really put stuff behind it to make it happen.
I agree with you. Linking back to Algenie, it sounds like you've had some really exciting wins so far. Have you had any missteps and pivots that you've had to take along the way?
Well, yeah. I mean, the central patents that we have involve making a helix. So we've hypothesized that if you grow algae in a very thin layer, and this is not our work, this has been done in academia, you can get light to the algae. So imagine a thin conveyor going down a slope, and light comes in from the sides from LEDs, a bit like a flat screen, like an advertising hoarding or your flat screen that, computer you might be looking at. LEDs down the side fire into the plastic, and that gives the light in this case, into the algae. Well, and then you take that conveyor and then you wind it around itself into this helix. So it's a bit like a slinky. Imagine a slinky, one of these. Well, how do you do that and make it really, really cheaply? Well, I knew that the only way to make that plastic helix would be on an extruder, because that's how you make cheap plastic things. You make drain pipes and channels, and that's the cheapest way of molding plastic. So I was thinking, well, could you do a helix on an extruder? And I talked to all the extrusion experts, and I knew most of the main players because I did a lot of extrusion when I was at Mars and when I was at PepsiCo. And they all told me that I was an idiot, and that you can only extrude things in a straight line because that's, it comes out of a die and it just goes straight forward. But because I'd actually made pasta before, and you think about Spirelli and Fusilli, I thought, well, hang on a minute, that's a helix. And actually it is, but it's obviously a very different sort of helix than what we're making. But I was too stupid to realize it was impossible. So I just said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And I found a small extruder company that was willing to take my money and run a trial. And we failed completely. It did not work. So I based the design of the die based on what I knew from how you make pasta. And it did not work at all. And yeah, we failed. But I told a lot of people that it was possible. So we had a choice. Either I give up and then just stop it. Because if I couldn't do this, I knew that the mission to get to this cost would never happen. I'd done the maths. It would never happen. So I went back and came up with a very, very different design, which was completely different thinking. But it was the only way I could think of to get this plastic to go round in a circle rather than go in a straight line. And we tried it, and it worked, and it did what I thought it would do. Now, not very well. I've got some examples of this first helix. It looks more like a fruit bowl than a perfectly engineered sort of optical system. But it was definitely, the plastic went round in a circle. And it was interesting thinking back at it. For me, there was no question about me going back. Of course I was going back because I'd said that it was possible. And it felt that I had no choice but to go back and make it happen. But that could have been a moment where I said, well, okay, I'll just retire and play pickleball instead. But I guess there was a sense that no, it's worth going back. There was something there that people had missed, and it was probably the thing that kind of gave it away was the absolute certainty of the experts who said, "No, I've been doing this for 40 years," and I thought, "You've been doing the same thing for 40 years, haven't you? You have never tried." And to be honest, no reason to try. There's no big benefit in being able. For most applications, you would never need to do it. But I detected a sense of, I reckon that was that was an industry that's never tried to do anything different, and therefore maybe they've missed something. So I don't know, or maybe just I am an idiot. I don't know.
How's that going? Have you figured that out yet?
Yeah, we're making beautiful helium. I made a full 2-meter stack the other day. It was absolutely wild. But I know the first time the thing came out, it was like we were dancing. It was like, and the guy who was who ran the extruder company, he couldn't believe it either. And he said to me afterwards, he said, "Look, I know I said that we could do it, but he didn't think. He didn't think." So every time we're down there doing trials, it's like magic for them because they'd never seen anything come off their machine.
Congratulations! Like that's truly amazing.
Yeah, it's nice, and it's nice that it's kind of like this is heavy engineering. This is manufacturing, which is not really a place where you do a lot of innovation. But it is nice to go back to my manufacturing roots and actually get working in factories again.
Yes, and what's next on the journey? What's the next big challenge to tackle?
Well, I mean, we're growing the business now, so now we're selling photobioreactors to universities, and we're raising money. Startup journey is always about raising money and getting to the next milestone. So we're raising money. We've got some safe notes that we're raising against now, and we'll be doing a seed round early next year to give us enough capital for us to start really growing. But so far, so good. We've got an amazing, very small, but an amazing team that's building all of this stuff, and we're growing algae and we're growing cyanobacteria, and they seem to go really well in our system. So we're at this very exciting sort of moment in time where this thing could actually happen. So
I look forward to watching that journey. That's really exciting. You're someone who has pivoted a lot in their career and really been at the forefront of new ecosystems and technologies. Thinking about failure and failing, I'll frame it as, what do you wish founders knew more and took away from those missteps and the failures that they currently don't? Because I often think about it from cultural lenses as well. Different cultures take on failure more harder than the others? So in Europe, as an example, there's a low risk-taking appetite, and they're not really willing to push the boundaries too much if the chance of failure is high. But yeah, just keen to hear from your perspective.
Yeah, I find it interesting to just sort of think about failure. What is failure? On whose terms? And it's kind of useful to have a really big mission, because then every little step is kind of a point on the journey. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. And certainly if you set your ambition quite big and into the future, then a little misstep along the way is a misstep or a pivot. If you set your ambition really, really near in, then the first misstep is the end of the journey. You've failed. So if you think big and you regard it as a sort of learning journey, it's not a failure. That's a judgment. And who's going to judge you? Is it you judging yourself? Is it society judging you? Is it that you've been to school and some teacher has told you, well, there's a right answer and a wrong answer, and you've got the wrong answer, therefore you're a failure? Whereas when you tackle really difficult, gnarly, complex problems, there is no right or wrong answer. There is a way forward that's useful, and that's about all you can say about it. So the mindset has got to be one of sort of experimentation and curiosity and moving forward in the right direction towards a goal, which is ultimately very useful and very inspiring. And if you define your journey in that way, then you don't really talk about it in terms of failures. Now, of course, you can go bankrupt because you run out of money. That's, in a way, that's a failure. But you define yourself in terms of the journey. And I think it's really important to do that. In fact, if you don't do that, you shouldn't really be an entrepreneur, because the chances of failing, certainly the chances of your one idea that you had, in a light bulb moment, and then you're going to execute it, the chances that is the thing that you're going to execute and it will be an ongoing business 5 years down the track is pretty much zero. It's always going to change from what you thought it would be. So just make sure that you frame it up in the right way, and then you vastly increases your chance of success, whatever success is. And that means sort of actually a positive step forward towards something that's useful, which would be my definition of success.
Some wise words. Thank you so much, Nick. It's been lovely having you with me today. I've learned a lot about algae, V2 food and plant-based meats. Thank you. And failure and success.
Yeah, it was great talking to you.